We want to move to our next story, which is related to the ongoing BDS campaigns all around the globe. But here in the United States, I think many people can remember last spring when students around the U.S. really raised the banner of solidarity with Palestine in a powerful, powerful way. At San Francisco State University, the efforts emerging from that have resulted in some concrete victories for divestment there. And we are really honored to be joined here by Dr. Rama Ali Kased, who's a professor of race and resistance studies at San Francisco State University, and Max Flynt, who's with the Students for Gaza and the General Union of Palestinian Students at San Francisco State as well. Thank you both so much for being with us here on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Well,
thanks for having us.
No, it's really great to have you here. I think this is a super important story of what's happening, and I kind of want both of your thoughts on this, but maybe Max, I'll just start with you. Tell us what took place. I mean, I know that there's been some big divestment victories. What has San Francisco State University agreed to do?
So we've actually agreed to divesting from weapons manufacturers that are aiding and abetting the genocide in Gaza. And at the same time, we are in talks and waiting for our human rights proposal to be passed. So we were actually able to create, alongside the administration through the work of the encampment, a human rights screening that would force our university to divest from any company abroad that violates human rights as defined by international law.
I think that now as we enter a new semester, I think that as the summer began, most of the pro-Israel advocates were hoping, as well as members of Congress, were hoping that all of this activism for Gaza, for Palestine would just subside, stop, go away, die out. A new semester has begun, and you all are beginning it with quite a punch. But I'm curious what your response is to the fact that students are actually rising up across campuses again. This hasn't gone away whatsoever. And in fact, people are coming back even more, fired up and ready to, fight for justice in Palestine than they were before.
Yeah, I think it's important that we keep moving forward, not only because, obviously the genocide is still going on. The encampments were super powerful, but they obviously weren't enough to end all U.S. aid to Israel, and we need to keep that fight going, no matter if we win divestment at our universities or not. My comrades at different schools across the state and across the nation were arrested, brutalized at UCLA. Those people aren't going to forget that. Just because the summer happened, we didn't forget the genocide was going on. We have a lot more work to do. We're nowhere close to done. Divestment is the bare minimum, and we're looking to spark a larger movement for labor, for whatever it's going to take to end U.S. aid to Israel, because we're tired of seeing our tax dollars, our tuition money, funding a genocide at the same time, like that we, at SF State, they're raising our tuition. The housing crisis in San Francisco is horrible. All these issues play into each other, all this money going to the military, and we're sick of it.
Rama, I feel that, one, this just on its own is a big victory, I think, in many ways, because this is what so many people have been pushing towards, is to really, ramp up divestment activities here in the United States, where, all of our institutions are so complicit. I was hoping you could also speak to this in the context of, especially talking about the struggle being ongoing, the continuum. We're talking about San Francisco State, the longest ever student strike in history, the Third World Student Front. Going back so many years, there's this history at SFSU of students making big stands like this. So I was hoping you could also put this in that context.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again for having me. I think it's important to note that, student activism, specifically around Palestine, goes back decades, right? With the formation of the Organization of Arab Students in the 1950s, and then the General Union of Palestine Students in the late 70s, and then the rise of NSJPs and SJPs across the nation in the early 2000s. So organizing, I always say that students are our igniters of our movement. They're the stewards of our movements. They carry our movement forward. They ensure we keep the history intact and the goals intact. So organizing for Palestine is part and parcel of our movement for the liberation of Palestine. In terms of SF State, yes, like you said, Eugene, SF State has a long history of student activism. It's part of the values and the mission and the culture embedded at SF State. San Francisco had, again, the longest student strike in history in the late 60s, led by the BSU, led by the Third World Liberation Front, to demand an education that not only reflected, the truths of their histories and their stories and their communities, but also an education where they can engage in real discourse around how do we create change in the community? How do we challenge racial injustice? How do we challenge economic injustice? How do we challenge social injustice? So that's the location of San Francisco State. And we utilize that history, carrying it forward as part of this campaign. And I want to say, just a little bit about the encampment at SF State. Our encampment started a little bit later than most of the encampments. The encampment started in late April. And there were a couple of unique unique things that happened at our encampment that I want to note. Again, a lot of other universities were doing this, but I know what we were doing at SF State. Some of those unique features was we elected students, wanted a democratic process as soon as possible and elected a student body to represent them, to ensure that the encampment was representative of who was in the encampment, but also the communications, the demands were clear and stayed intact throughout the process. We also held the very first public negotiations. Students asked the administration to come down to the encampment and held a public, the first meeting of the encampment administration was public, with hundreds, and media were part of that and watched that negotiation happen publicly. And third, the faculty on our campus, as soon as the tent sprung up, organized themselves tightly and declared that they would be the front line, ensuring that our students were safe, ensuring that what we saw, the dehumanization that we saw happening across the campus, wasn't happening on our campus. That we wanted to ensure that the students' voices were clear, their demands are clear, and that they were safe. And I think those were some of the main features of our encampment on our campus. It was a very unified front on our encampment.
So this is a question I want to ask to both Max and to you, Dr. Rama, and I'll start with Max on this, in the sense that, both students and professors are facing some serious attacks across the country by the Israel lobby, as well as just establishment politicians who, want to protect imperialism in various ways, whether it's like smear campaigns and slander by various organizations, or in the case of professors, you've had these sort of McCarthyist witch hunt type hearings in front of Congress, naming specific people and demanding they be fired, right? So, Max, I want to start with you on this. What's your response as a student? I know perhaps, at San Francisco State University, there's a little bit more support than you might get at other schools, but this is certainly something that, students are having to really decide whether they want to put their names behind supporting the, stopping, for example, Israel weapons to Israel, because it could perhaps impact their ability to stay in school. It could impact their ability to get a job in the future. I'm curious how you respond to that, and maybe what your message is to students who might be watching and want to get involved, but they're afraid because of what they saw happen last semester.
I would say the best response to repression, and we saw this with Columbia, as soon as the encampment had sprung up and their president had told NYPD to storm that encampment, it brought more students to the cause, because it's easy to arrest 50 students who are doing a protest, but if hundreds and thousands of students are standing up and using their voices to fight for Palestinian liberation, to fight to end all U.S. aid to Israel, there's no more threat of being doxxed. Because if the entire country is saying the exact same thing, if students are walking out of their classes saying the exact same thing, you can't single out students, you can't single out leaders, because the people are with you. The mass movement is with you. So I would say to students across the country, the encampments were effective, but we're going to need to build something bigger, a mass movement, something that will spark something larger, that will unite students, and not just students, but labor, because we can't do this without labor. And we like to harp on that at San Francisco State. We couldn't have done that without the labor union, with our professors here at State protecting us. And we really think that we, the encampments were great, but we're looking forward. We don't want to get stuck on that. And the repression is just going to keep coming if our movement gets smaller.
Yeah.
And Dr. Rama, I guess, could you maybe respond to the sort of position that professors are put in with this issue, because you're talking about people's livelihoods being threatened and in some cases being blacklisted in ways that will just make it impossible to ever be able to get work in the future?
Yeah. I mean, I think first we need to hold the administration accountable and the forces that are enabling this and bowing down to the bullying that's happening, right? I think masks have been, people have been exposed, right? The people who are attacking pro-Palestinian voices, the supremacists and the racists that are attacking the pro-Palestinian voices are joining forces with other right-wing, other supremacists and other forces attacking things like pro-Palestinian voices, attacking critical ethnic studies, attacking critical race theory. We saw that at CSU LA, right? It was the Zionists and the white supremacists who joined forces to attack our students, and the administration sat by and just let it happen, right? I think we need to hold administration accountable. I think we need to hold those who have the ruling power accountable, the institutional power, to say you can't bow down to supremacists, right? You can't bow down to the racists. You can't bow down to folks who are impeding on the academic freedom, quote unquote, of faculty and students, right? And these are the same people who don't care about public institutions, right? And again, for bullying our public institutions, they're the ones who are advocating for the unfunding and the disinvestment from our public institutions, and our administration and those in power are bowing down to them, right? And it's time for us to hold those folks accountable in this new McCarthyism era that we're seeing, and that's sending shockwaves, right? That who's actually promoting this, who's pushing it, and holding those folks accountable, right? That, when we look at who those folks are, it's not people who care about public institutions like San Francisco State University, right? Or an education that reflects the true history of this country or other countries. So for us, we need to continue exposing that, and we need to continue holding those folks accountable.
No, well, critically important points and critically important work, and I really appreciate it. Dr. Rama Ali Kased, Max Flynt, thank you both so much for joining us here and bringing us this positive message of struggle and some victories. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Free Palestine.